Thank you, Sue Ellen. So welcome, everyone. We're so delighted to have you and our speakers. I want to thank our co-sponsors, which is Mass Peace Action. Cole Harrison is here. The Community Church of Boston, the Unitarian Universalists for Justice in the Middle East, the Massachusetts chapter, and thank you to Susan Nye especially, and to Jewish Voice for Peace Boston. And I saw that Elsa Auerbach is here from that. We have a 7.5-minute video to show before having the speakers. It's called Stop the Annexation. I'm going to try and show it on my screen here. If you'll just hold on 1 second. Can you all see that red box with the video?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, so, and Tony, when I play, can you raise your hand if you can hear the sound the minute I press play, Tony?
Summer of 2020 might turn out to be a horrible memory, and not just because of the coronavirus. What we recall as a dreadful turning point may be a wonderful once-in-a-lifetime opportunity for them.
This is a historic.
An undefeated Israeli prime minister who crushes all opposition, an American president unrestrained and dangerous, Europe in political chaos, Arab nations exhausted by instability, the Palestinians divided and in despair, and a mysterious pandemic cloud that floats above everything. All the stars have aligned for a single magical moment. Finally, they can shout it loud and clear, annexation. But if that doesn't put you in the mood for celebration, then you must be wondering, where did all this talk of annexation suddenly come from? How is it different from what we've known so far? And why the hell now?
המציאות היום בגדה היא מציאות של עליונים ונחותים, היהודים הישראלים והפלסטינים. האפרטהייד הזה, ברגע שיהיה סיפוח, יעבור שדרוג. זה שרע היום, זה לא אומר שלא יכול להיות רע יותר.
First of all, let's take a look at the map of the West Bank. Area A includes the big Palestinian cities and villages, which is under civilian and security control of the Palestinian Authority. Area B includes 440 rural Palestinian communities under Israeli security control and Palestinian civil control. Area C, which is everything else, is under full Israeli control. Now it's all clear, isn't it? Really? Look at this mess. Area A and B are in fact made up of tiny enclaves, scattered and disconnected. If that's not complicated enough, Area C contains most of the agricultural land owned by Palestinians living in areas A and B. And every time they access their fields, they go through countless restrictions and humiliations.
השאלה הכי חשובה, איך הסיפוח הזה ישפיע על חיי היום-יום של אותם בני אדם. אנחנו לא מתעסקים רק באדמות, אנחנו לא מתעסקים באיזה חפצים, אנחנו מתעסקים כאן בבני אדם שמבחינתה של ישראל הם כלי כדי להגיע לאותו חזון פוליטי של הרחבת הטריטוריה של ישראל, ובאותו כלי אותם בני אדם אינם נראים.
Let's say Israel annexes half of Area C, as suggested in the Trump plan. Maximum area with minimum Palestinians. A supposedly bureaucratic step, almost technical, even banal. But in reality, it could lead to a string of disasters. A lose-lose situation where almost everyone suffers, raising countless concerns.
איפה יגורו, את מי הם יבקרו, באיזה אוניברסיטה הם ילמדו, האם הם יהיו תושבי קבע כמו מזרח ירושלים, האם הם יהיו ללא מעמד כלשהו.
What happens to private Palestinian lands in the annexed area? Are they expropriated? And what about the Palestinians that live in communities that Israel doesn't recognize? Do they become illegal aliens on their land?
מפת הסיפוח ככל הנראה תכלול הרבה מאוד שטח וכמה שפחות פלסטינים שהם יישארו בעצם מחוץ לשטח המסופח, אבל הם יהיו מוקפים מכל עבריהם בישראל הריבונית. והדבר הזה מזכיר מאוד את המדיניות של דרום אפריקה בתקופת האפרטהייד. לדחוק את השחורים אל עבר שמורות ולהגיד לעולם זה מדינות, הם אזרחים של המדינות האלה. ככה אנחנו דוחקים את הפלסטינים לאזורים הבנויים שלהם ואומרים לעולם זה מדינה, לכן זה לא אפרטהייד. לא. כך נראה גם האפרטהייד המקורי.
נתניהו פרסם הצהרה שהפלסטינים לא יקבלו מעמד של אזרחות או מעמד של תושבי קבע אחרי הסיפוח. מה זה אומר? שאפשר לעשות בהם את הכל. אפשר לעשות להם טרנספר, אפשר לגרש אותם, יהיה כאן מה שנקרא internally displaced persons, וזה בדיוק מה שישראל רוצה להגיע אליו.
Annexation will also affect the lives of Israelis inside Israel.
אנחנו נצטרך לקבל אחריות על השטחים, על שטחי A ו-B ועל 3 מיליון פלסטינים. לדבר הזה יש השלכות ביטחוניות, כלכליות ומדיניות.
How many billions of dollars will be wasted on infrastructure and security in the newly annexed areas? What will happen with Jordanian and Egyptian peace agreements? And how many lives will be lost?
השיח הציבורי על הסיפוח הוא פגום. לא ממש מספרים לישראלים מה המשמעויות של הסיפוח, לאן מובילים אותנו, מה העתיד של הדבר הזה. בתרחישים די סבירים אנחנו נאלץ להיכנס פנימה לרמאללה ולשכם ולג'נין ולחזור ולנהל את החיים היומיומיים של הפלסטינים. זו מלחמה, זה הקזת דם של הפלסטינים ושלנו.
If annexation is bad for everyone, why the hell is it happening? That's the point. Some people actually profit from the situation. And sadly, they hold the keys right now. For Israel's prime minister, the timing couldn't be better. Instead of reports about his ongoing corruption trials and the devastating economical crisis, he prefers to be remembered as the one who fulfilled the vision of a greater Israel. It's also a great opportunity for President Trump, who relies on the support of the evangelicals to win his re-election. And many of them believe annexation is God's word.
Hopefully, I will have that evangelical support, because you know what? If they vote, we win.
And of course, there's the radical Jewish right, fantasizing about the legitimacy to build more and more settlements wherever they want.
You can't bury the truth forever. It's time to tell the world the truth.
No empty promises or lies can hide the truth. Annexation is a powder keg in an already volatile place. The curse we bequeath to our children and grandchildren. A future filled with war, violence, and injustice.
המציאות שלנו עומדת להשתנות. אם יהיה סיפוח, היא תשתנה לרעה מאוד מאוד. אבל אם המאבק שלנו יצליח, ואנחנו נסכל את הסיפוח, אנחנו נעמוד בפני מציאות פוליטית חדשה לחלוטין. ואז פתאום, בתוך הדבר הנורא הזה, ממנו יבקעו הזדמנויות. כי החישוב מחדש של המסלול שלנו לגבי הגדה המערבית לא יכלול יותר את האפשרות של סיפוח. ואז נצטרך לחשוב, אז מה כן?
Summer of 2020 doesn't have to be like that. It could also be the moment when annexation fails. The summer when we realize that the terrible situation we are living with doesn't have to last forever.
כל אדם, כל גוף, כל מדינה שמאמינים בערכים בסיסיים של זכויות אדם חייבים להתנגד לסיפוח, כי לא יצא מזה שום דבר טוב, לא לפלסטינים ולא לישראלים, ולכן חייבים למנוע אותו ולהתנגד אליו.
Okay. So, yeah, Steve. So by the way, annexation was supposed to happen on July 1st of this year, and that date kind of came and went. And then there have been a number of, developments since then, which I think Leila and Phyllis will tell us about, not least of which are the Arab countries who are being asked to normalize relations with Israel. So I'm delighted to introduce Leila Farsakh, who's the Associate Professor and Chair of the Political Science Department at UMass Boston. She's a Senior Research Fellow at the Center for Development Studies at Birzeit University in the West Bank, and the author of Palestinian Labor Migration to Israel, Labor, Land, and the Occupation. So Leila and Phyllis, we've invited to speak for about 15 minutes, just to tell you, and then we'll open it for Q&A. So Leila, welcome, and over to you.
Thank you very much for inviting me, and thank you for having such a good crowd. I wouldn't have thought that on a Wednesday night at 7 o'clock, so many people want to hear about the annexation. And thank you too also for showing this video, which was really what I wanted to talk about. But I think it made it a little bit easier because you're having Israeli lawyers from, talking about how Israel is creating an apartheid reality. Now, I will have them to change a little bit what I was going to talk about, but I will also address some of the issues because I'm tasked with explaining what are the implications or why the annexation and what's the implication for the Palestinians and for the peace process. And Phyllis will talk more about the regional implication because I think the annexation, the whole threat of annexation is more important regionally than domestically. But what I will do is I will show a few maps just to situate the annexation in its historical context because the video we just saw, which I thought did well in showing how we have an apartheid reality, has tended to show the annexation as if it is an exceptional thing that Zionism wants to do, as if it's only the right wing who wants to do annexation, and as if the annexation is what's going to ruin the whole peace process. And actually, I'd like to show you that actually the annexation is part and parcel of what Israel, both left and right, Labor and Likud, middle and far right, envisaged ever since Israel occupied the West Bank and Gaza in 1967. So, and I also see it as a culmination of the Trump plan. I will show you now in the map of the Trump plan which he presented as the final peace, the best of all peace deals. The annexation is part of that plan and part of the US strategy, which is very important under Trump, which marks the final, the clear message by the American administration that it is fully in support of Israeli position, fully in support of unilateralism for any attempt to solve the Israeli-Palestinian problem, and that the US is behind the Israeli right demand, including having Jerusalem declared the eternal capital of Israel, including that there will be, the Palestinian state will only be on 70% of the West Bank, including no discussion with Hamas. So if you allow me, I'll share these three maps with you and just go over them slightly to show you how. So here we are. This is the one I want to show. Sorry. Okay. So this is the Trump peace plan. As I said, the annexation is part of the Trump plan because the annexation envisaged annexing 30% of the West Bank, which is along the Jordan Valley, over here. And that's something that the Palestinians have always said is important for them because that's the only way how they can have borders, continuous borders. But Israel, with the Trump plan, has said Jerusalem will be the unified capital of Israel. So you see here, Palestinians will not have Jerusalem. Palestinians have to admit Israel as a Jewish state. And there will be no right of return. And the Palestinian state will be along 70% of the West Bank. And in replacement for the land it will lose, this 30%, they propose to give the Palestinians some land here in Gaza, okay? And this state also will be demilitarized. Now, there was also fanfare about how bad this deal is and how bad the annexation is, but I wanna show you that actually this is a culmination of what has happened since Oslo. This is a map that shows you the West Bank. The blue dots are the settlements. They don't occupy much area. Okay, in total, the amount of area, built up areas of settlement in the West Bank is around 7 to 10%. But they occupy larger spaces. Okay. Here, this is the idea of the separation barrier, which Israel has built. It's around 700 kilometers, of which now 60% of it has been built. And these are the areas that Israel intends to annex into Israel. These are on the west side of the West Bank, or the east part of Israel. But they go into the Palestinian areas, as you can see here, because this is where all the settlements are. Today, there are still 130 settlements, in which 650,000 Israelis are living. But Israel also envisages this along the Jordan Valley. This is the part that we'll talk about when we talk about annexation. You can see all the blue dots is where the settlements are. This is what Israel wants to annex. It has already, this is part of Area C. Ever since the Oslo peace process was signed, this was part of Area C. that Palestinians have restricted access to, especially as Israel built bypass roads. Now, the blue lines that you see here, the blue roads, are what we call Israeli roads, bypass roads. The red one are the Palestinian roads. The blue roads connect the settlements into Israel as one single entity. The yellow dots here are the checkpoints, the major checkpoints. Today we have still 99 checkpoints in the West Bank. But just to give you a feel of how an apartheid reality looks like, because when you look at this map, Palestinians who are in the north of the West Bank cannot get in contact with those in the center of the West Bank, let alone those in the south of the West Bank, because any area they want to go to is cut by checkpoints, which Israel regulates, and also ensures that Jerusalem is out of access for the Palestinians. Okay? So is this really new? As I said to you, with this map, you see the annexation plan is a culmination of what Israel has been doing, especially since Oslo. But Israel planning of segmenting the West Bank and Israel idea that it needs to get this area along the Jordan Valley has been already in the books ever since Israel occupied the West Bank and Gaza in 1967. So this map shows you clearly the three maps, which I like to show one beside each other. One is called the Alon Plan. The Alon Plan was a plan in 1967, where the Israeli cabinet, after the war of 67, which allowed Israel to occupy the West Bank and Gaza, there was a national unity government, which means a government that included all the parties of Israel, from the right to the left. And they discussed together what are they going to do with the land that they occupied. And it was clear to them at the time that annexation was out of question because the Palestinian population in the West Bank and Gaza was large. If Israel would have annexed the West Bank and Gaza in 1967, 40% of the population under its control would have been Palestinian. And Israel did not want to do that because it compromised, of course, the idea of a Jewish state. But Israel, and this guy Alon, who was an important, at the time, Minister of Interior Affairs, I believe, came up with this idea is that in any negotiation plan, the idea at the time was to negotiate with Jordan. Israel wants to keep control of 25 to 45% of the West Bank. And this included the area around Jerusalem, which you see here, okay, and the Jordan Valley, which is here. Now, when we go from 1967 until Oslo, where Israel recognized the PLO, recognized Palestinians have political rights, and we go up to Camp David negotiations, which were supposed to produce the final status negotiation. If you look at the map, again, we find that Israel wants to keep the Jordan Valley, wants to control Jerusalem, and wanted to give the Palestinians, at the time the debate was to give them sovereignty over 90% of the West Bank and 90% of Gaza, but with the understanding that these Palestinian areas are still cut by bypass roads and by settlements. And when you come to the Trump plan, 20 years later, you see this is a concretization with little modification, where Israel's intention since Oslo was not to give the Palestinian a contiguous Palestinian state, but to affirm its presence in the land. It wanted to take the land without the people. But in the process, what it actually did is an apartheid. And as explained in the video, as you can see in these maps, it's an apartheid because Palestinians have no sovereignty and cannot have sovereignty because they cannot have their own autonomous borders. They cannot move without bypass, without crossing by Israeli checkpoints. And they have to have permits, not dissimilar from the pass system that was in South Africa. And this is why people like to compare. This is a map of South Africa, the Bantustans in South Africa, which also the natives had only control over 11% of their land. But their lands were actually much bigger than the West Bank. But still, the idea of fragmenting the population, divide and conquer, but maintain sovereignty for only the settlers. Okay, so the question now becomes, how do we go from there? And what are the implications for the Palestinians and for Israelis. Insofar as the Palestinians and this is are concerned, I think what its importance is that the annexation has confirmed for the Palestinians, whether it happens or not, that they are living in an apartheid reality and there is no possibility for a two-state solution. So basically, we are living in a one-state reality, which is an apartheid reality. And the challenge for the Palestinians today is how to articulate a progressive political agenda that talks about turning the struggle for the Palestinians is not their own state, but a struggle for equal, collective, and individual rights in a single state. This is a difficult question because of the reality of the oppression, but it's something that cannot be put away anymore. And the annexation accentuates it because whether it happens or not is going to accentuate the fact that Israel will have under its control 5 million Palestinians without political rights. We have Israel for the time being can succeed because we have nearly 2 million in the Gaza Strip, which are under siege, nobody hears of. And it's fascinating how the video does not talk at all about the Gaza Strip, while the Gaza Strip is central to the Palestinians. The annexation, if it happens, will displace more Palestinians. These, if they're going to go into Palestinian areas under the PA is fully dependent on international aid, which comes and from the transfer of funds from Israel. If Israel's not going to do it, people are going to be more in dire situation. And the legitimacy of the Palestinian Authority has been eroded over the past 20 years. And the fact that it would collapse is not because people are supportive of it, it's because people have not yet found a better alternative. So they accept that the existence of the Palestinian Authority is more of a local authority with very limited possibilities. As to the Palestinian inside 48, the Palestinian citizens of Israel, the annexation for them is neither here nor there. It just makes they are the only Palestinians who have citizenship in Israel, have political right that they can use, and with which they can mobilize to insist on Israel being less of an apartheid state or a non-apartheid state, which is a particularly difficult challenge that they cannot do. Now, before I give it to Phyllis, I just want to point out two things that the video I found particularly problematic about the video in explaining that the annexation is bad for everybody. I don't think the annexation as a plan is bad for the Israelis for two reasons. It's bad for Israelis in the long run, but I think it's already too late. Israel is an apartheid reality, and any apartheid reality in the long run is not sustainable. In that respect, it is problematic. But for the time being, Israelis are living a very good life. I mean, they don't see the reality of the Palestinians in the West Bank. They know nothing about the reality of the Palestinians in Gaza. They are doing well economically. They are doing well regionally, as Phyllis will explain right now. What this crisis is pointing to us is how far we've gone away from the two-state solution and how far we are living in a situation of such inequality that is bound to collapse. But the way it will collapse is no longer by simply Palestinians talking with Israelis. Now the Palestinian struggle has become much more interwoven with the Arab citizen struggle for equality and dignity. And I think although now we are at a very bad moment for the Palestinian cause and for the cause of Arab nationalists or Arab citizens who are struggling against the oppressive regimes, I think that moving forward, the prospects are still undecided which way it's going to go. But in my view, it's forcing everybody to do some serious thinking about how you're going to articulate an agenda, a progressive agenda of turning Israel into a state of all its citizens. And I think among the Palestinians who are best placed to take that lead in that debate is the Palestinian citizens of Israel. And it's also not a coincidence that the chief person who was talking on this video was actually a Palestinian citizen of Israel who's also a lawyer. So I'll stop at this point. I'll let Phyllis speak and then maybe we can take some questions and answers. Thank you.
Thank you. I want to introduce Phyllis Bennis. Many of us have heard her speak in Boston and on various events, of course, virtually. She's a senior fellow at the Institute for Policy Studies. She's one of the founders of the U.S. Campaign for Palestinian Rights, a board member for Jewish Voice for Peace, and she's the author of Understanding the Palestinian-Israeli Conflict. And she pointed out to me that it's published by Interlink, which is a publishing company run by a Palestinian family that's based in Northampton, right next door. So Phyllis, we're delighted to have you.
Thanks very much. Thank you, Leila, for that great presentation, and thanks for the film. I hadn't seen it either. It's already a little bit outdated, although it was apparently made in the spring. But it's a fascinating moment that we're looking at. Thank you to all of you for organizing the event tonight. It's great to be with people who remember that there are international issues as we face the crisis of COVID, the crisis of our elections, the crisis of racism in this country, that there still is the rest of the world to deal with. I'm going to speak a little bit about the question of the international implications and the regional implications of this issue of annexation. As Leila said so clearly, annexation is already in existence. It's de facto annexation. What we're talking about is will there or will there not be de jure or legal annexation, which would have some impact. It would make diplomacy more difficult for Palestinian diplomats, but Palestinian diplomacy, frankly, hasn't gone very far because it's been very focused on this idea of the two-state solution with swaps. You have to say it very fast and all together. Two-state solution with swaps. And that hasn't really gone anywhere. The question is, I think, for all of us, as well as for Palestinians, whether the discussion, the possibility, the likelihood of transforming this de facto process into a legal claimed process. It wouldn't be legal in international law, but the Israelis and the US would claim that it's legal. Would that make it possible to discuss things in the context of apartheid and building an anti-apartheid movement, a global movement, the way we saw the last anti-apartheid movement, which was around South Africa? It would be harder for those few governments around the world that have tried to challenge settlements, but they never really were able to move very seriously anyway. So that probably wouldn't be a huge impact. It would maybe make some things possible at the United Nations, the reopening of the UN Committee Against Apartheid, the reopening of the old Center Against Apartheid that played such an important role in building global support for the movement against apartheid in South Africa. Could the International Covenant Against the Crime of Apartheid get a new life, get some new energy? All of that is possible. Will there be major changes on the ground? That's less clear. Things are as bad on the ground as people were anticipating they would get under annexation. So there's not so much clarity that the situation on the ground would be that dramatically changing. There is a problem, and Leila importantly mentioned this, that too many people, Israelis, people in the US, and unfortunately people around the world, seem to believe that if there is no official announcement of annexation, then everything's okay. That if we don't have annexation, the current situation is more or less okay. I think that for the moment, it is okay for Israelis. I think that it is possible to maintain this for Israelis. As Leila said, they're doing fine. This is not sustainable for Palestinians. Many of you will remember that 5 years ago, the United Nations, several of its humanitarian organizations and agencies came together and issued a stunningly powerful and devastating report on the conditions in Gaza and said that by 2020, if things do not change, Gaza will be unlivable. Well, we're almost done with 2020. Gaza is unlivable, and yet there are 2 million people, the majority of them children under the age of 18, who are living there. So that's what we have to face. For the US, the reason that annexation was so central to the US proposal for what they like to call Israeli-Palestinian peace is that their focus was very much on the region, not really on Israel-Palestine at all. That's a real difference. It goes back to the precedent that was set in 1991, right after the first Gulf War, when the first Bush administration launched a so-called peace process that was based on this theory of being outside in. It was going to challenge the earlier versions of peace processes that were going to be inside out. And what those terms referred to was, do you start by bringing the Israelis and Palestinians together, the inside, and you bring peace between Israelis and Palestinians, and then the Arab states, the outside, would kind of have to go along. Well, that wasn't working so well by 1991. So the US decided to reverse itself and go outside in, meaning let's start with building relations between more Arab states and Israel. And when all the Arab states are allied with Israel, then the Palestinians will have no choice but to come along, right? Well, the process in Madrid didn't go very far either. But this is, in a sense, a return to that, saying we're not even really going to deal with the question of peace in anything resembling what we understand to be the real definition of peace, what Martin Luther King taught us, that peace is not simply the absence of war, but the presence of justice. The presence of justice. There was never any discussion of justice for Palestinians. In fact, there was never really any discussion about peace either. But the US plan for Israel-Palestine, which we might call the Crown Prince's plans, because it was launched basically by the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia, the Crown Prince of the UAE, and the guy who wanted to be the Crown Prince in the United States, Jared Kushner. And it wasn't really about peace at all. It was something that was going to deal with relations between Israel and countries who were not at war with Israel. So it wasn't about bringing peace. It's about war. It was about war with Iran. It wasn't about Palestine at all. It's about weapons sales and bringing other countries under the US security umbrella. And it was about Israel. It was not about Palestine or Palestinians or rights. And then, of course, it was about the US elections. So given that formal annexation seems to be off the agenda at this point, and the Israelis have acknowledged that they've taken it off the agenda temporarily, the UN ambassador said not too long ago that it's not over, we're just delaying it for a while, but it's not on the agenda right now. And I think in that context, we can also say that a two-state solution is pretty much over too, not because anybody likes it or doesn't like it. I have my own opinions about it, most Palestinians do. And I learned long ago that this is not my call. You know, I'm a Jewish girl from California. I don't get to say how many states there should be 7,000 miles away from here. What I get to do, what I have an obligation to do, is to push my government to change its policy to one that is based on equality and rights, equal rights for all. Not how many states there are. If there's one state, equal rights for everybody in that state. If there's two states, equal rights within and between those states. That was never really talked about. There was never equality between states, even on the rhetorical agenda. So what are we looking at now when we look at these processes of normalization that are going on in the Middle East? Right now, we're seeing it among the Gulf states from Bahrain and the UAE, who have normalized relations with Israel. So what do they get? What's the basis of this US created program? They get peace with Israel, a country they were not at war with, and a country that they all had pretty strong relations with already, but relations that were covert. They never could acknowledge it because there was so much popular antagonism. There was, let's remember, a decision by the Arab League that there would be no normalization of relations between Arab governments and Israel until the end of Israeli oppression of Palestinians. The Arab peace agreement that the Saudis introduced in 2002, which was accepted by the Arab League and became for a while the kind of go-to global plan that the UN was looking at, it said very explicitly, there will be no normalization until an end to the occupation of the West Bank and Gaza and East Jerusalem. And there would be a host of other questions of equality, including the right of return for Palestinian refugees, as determined in international law. So this was very clear. The decisions that were made by the governments of Bahrain and the UAE deliberately violate that agreement by the Arab states. Now, the UAE says it was only a declaration of peace. Bahrain says it was, in fact, a treaty. It's not clear what the difference is between those. What does it do? For those countries, it ensures greater involvement of the US, greater US protection. Not only more weapons, they'll sell all the weapons they want. They're going to sell Bahrain the F-35 fighter jet, something that these countries really don't need, and that no countries in the region other than Israel have been allowed to buy before, because Israel, by the US, is guaranteed a strategic advantage. That's guaranteed by US law. And this allows Israel to gain access to more weapons, because to maintain that strategic advantage, if Arab countries get more weapons, Israel will have to get even more than they do. So to go back to what the Gulf states get, they ensure greater involvement of US protection. They get to be closer to the US in shaping a strategy for the region that's based on building an Israel-based Israeli, Saudi, UAE, Bahrain coalition against Iran. This has been the Trump focus in the region. Israel, yes, we'll do anything Israel wants. I'll do anything Israel wants, he says, because I want Sheldon Adelson to give me the millions of dollars I need to win elections. And Sheldon Adelson, who is very close to the furthest right-wing elements within Israel, not only Bibi Netanyahu, but further to the right, supports settlements directly, supports the most right-wing elements there. So Trump was willing to support all of them as well. He appointed a great supporter of the settlements to be the US ambassador to Israel, David Friedman, and appointed his own son-in-law, of course, to be in charge of all of this. So the Gulf states get to escalate their existing ties with both Israel and the US. They get brownie points from the US for embracing Israel, which means they get access to more guarantees despite Israel's qualitative military edge that they're supposed to have. And let's be clear, they do have some real fears about Iran. The Iran-Saudi competition in the region also affects the other Gulf states. The other Gulf states have small Shia populations. They're not majority by any stretch of the imagination. And in Bahrain, it's a majority by a small margin. In the UAE, it's about 15%. In Saudi Arabia, nobody's very sure, but it could be as much as 25% of the population. And given the connections of religion and sectarianism in the region, Shia forces in all these countries, which are ruled by Sunni forces and are predominantly Shia, except for Bahrain, they tend to look to Iran for some levels of support. And in the case of Saudi Arabia, it should be noted that the Shia population there, whether it's 15% or 25%, is located in the areas closest to the Saudi oil fields. So that's something that always worries the Saudi rulers. So that's what we're looking at. They get access to more arms. They get access to Israeli markets. They don't have to worry anymore about hiding their long-standing commercial and security relations with Israel that have been going on for decades now. And they get credit they think, for their own population by claiming that they are responsible for Israel pulling back from annexation. Now, in fact, as we know, Israel has said they're not going to move towards annexation anyway. But if the Gulfies want to claim it, then they can claim it. So what does Israel get from all of this? Israel gets to brag, Bibi Netanyahu, who's under great electoral pressure, very much like Trump, and like Trump, only it's more public. The minute he's no longer the prime minister, he's facing very serious criminal charges for a whole range of thefts that he has allegedly carried out. But under these conditions, he can brag about bringing normalization between Israel and the Arab world. He gives up nothing since annexation was already being delayed. They get new markets in the Arab world. They get new trade relations, new security ties. It undermines any state boycotts, which really didn't exist much anyway. It won't have that much impact on the BDS movement, the Boycott, Divestment, Sanctions movement, because that's a movement of people, not of governments. So it doesn't have the same impact. But the old Arab League call for a boycott, which, as I say, doesn't really exist anymore anyway, but this really ends it altogether. It isolates the Palestinians diplomatically, because even though the even though the Arab states weren't supporting the Palestinians very much for many, many years, rhetorically they did. And so the lack of that means that it makes it easier for Arab states, for African states, for the Europeans, for all those governments who have felt compelled at various points to at least talk about support for Palestinian rights. It makes it much easier for them to say, halas, enough, we don't have to do that anymore. So this is a serious gain for Israel without giving up anything of their qualitative military edge. And then what does this mean in terms of the US gains consolidation of the Israel supporters from the far right, which mainly means the evangelical Christian Zionists, far more than in the Jewish community, which still has not moved with Trump besides all of this. This great support for Israel has become very much a Republican reality. It's no longer the kind of bipartisan reality it long was in the United States. And that means that there's real shifts underway, despite the best efforts of Trump and his minions to bring these massive shifts, moving the US embassy to Jerusalem, recognizing Jerusalem as the unified capital of Israel, recognizing the so-called legitimacy of Israeli occupation of the Golan Heights, the whole range of moves, everything Israel has asked for has been accepted, recognizing the legitimacy of settlements, calling overtly for annexation. And then we get to the question of, well, what's going to be different after the elections? If Trump claims and wins the election, we'll see even worse aspects of all of this. But let me talk for just a minute about if Biden wins the elections, because we're going to have a huge struggle on our hands. They are not the same. And I think anyone who says that there's no difference between the two parties, there's no difference between Biden and Trump on Israel, is really making a huge mistake. There are enormous differences. But that does not mean that Biden supports Palestinian rights. One of the biggest differences, because he maintains a largely uncritical view of the US relationship with Israel, the $3.8 billion a year in military aid to Israel. The difference is that the party he speaks for, the party he represents, has now been split between its left and centrist wings. And he is going, if he wins, it will be because the left wing, under the leadership of people like Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders and the Squad and a whole host of new forces inside and outside of Congress, are demanding that their supporters vote for Biden and then pressure Biden. He's going to have to take that into account in a whole new way. And that's going to make new possibilities possible, not inevitable. We're not going to be able to take anything for granted. And we're going to have to be mobilizing from day one. But it's going to be far more possible because of that split within the Democratic Party on other issues. We should realize that foreign policy is the issue where the gap between the two wings of the party is the widest. Pressure from organizations like Sunrise and the Green New Deal supporters have forced Biden's wing of the party to move towards a much clearer, much better position on issues of climate. The same has been true on immigration. On issues of foreign policy, there's not been that much pressure, not enough pressure, and there's not been that kind of motion. So when we look at it from outside, I work for a nonprofit, I don't endorse candidates, but I can look analytically at what we see. What we see is that the gap between the two wings of the Democratic Party is greatest on the issues of foreign policy. So it's going to be a very difficult move.
That's
I want to finish
superb,
just a
Phyllis.
moment. Yeah. Well,
Yeah.
I can stop there then.
Let's stop there because I think that people will ask questions. And in fact, you just answered the first question that was posted, what
Sure.
happens if Biden wins, so we can cross that one off. But thank you both so very much, and thank you, Phyllis, for that great presentation. So Tony, do you want to pick the first question to pose? So Phyllis answered the Biden question. Tony, unmute. Tony, we can't hear you.
Thank you. Palestine will improve under, we did the Biden question, okay.
Sudan, maybe.
Sudan gets off the no-no list. Can you talk about implications of a deal with Sudan regarding rest of Africa?
Yeah, this is a really good question, and I don't think we know all the answers yet. For those of you who haven't followed it closely, Sudan was essentially offered a way out of the so-called supporters of terrorism list. Sudan had been on that list from 1993 after the attacks, the Al-Qaeda attacks on US embassies in Kenya and Tanzania, and the attack on the US coal in the year 2000. It was held responsible for having allowed Al-Qaeda forces allegedly to operate within Sudan. One of the things that this speaks to is the complete artificial politicized nature of this so-called anti-terrorism list. The fact is that Sudan was allowed off the list because it agreed to pay the United States $335 million in reparations to the families of diplomats and others who were injured and killed in those two bombing attacks. And that was enough to essentially buy its way out of the deal. And it had to do one other thing. Besides give the millions of dollars of money to the US, it had to agree to normalize relations with Israel. So the US is now holding up this idea of normalization with Israel from Arab countries, and in this case, a North African country, an African country that's part of the Arab world, as the basis for its being taken off the terrorism list, which will allow it to engage in international trade, apply for international aid, etc., become more of a, quote, normal country. So it's a very dangerous precedent, but it does speak very clearly to the artificial nature of that so-called terrorism list. If it was really a terrorist threat, $335 million wouldn't have been enough to take it off the list. It's on the list as a political statement, not as a security statement. So I think that's what we're looking at. Elsewhere in Africa, there has been a huge Israeli diplomatic and economic campaign underway for about the last decade to try and win support from the generally very weak African governments. Only a few of the African governments are usually prepared to stand up, led by South Africa and Namibia, the countries that experience their own anti-apartheid struggles. Those are the two that have been the most consistent in standing up at the UN and elsewhere for Palestinian rights.
Thank you. Leila, I have a question. What are you hearing from the Palestinians within Israel proper in terms, I'm not sure if you spoke to this, how are they responding to this threat of annexation or the sort of the geopolitical surround? And you need to unmute, Leila. Leila, can you unmute?
The Palestinian citizens of Israel are all like the other Palestinians. They don't see, they are aware that the annexation is just a consolidation of what has been going on. Okay, it's not here, neither here nor there. You know, opposing the annexation will not make the Palestinians become closer to their rights or not. I mean, of course, as Phyllis said, the legal implications are not minor, but this is why Israel did not do it. Okay, Israel could have annexed anytime it wanted. The reason why it was talked about in this phase was largely for, as Phyllis explained, for geostrategic reason as well as for Netanyahu's own concern. The issue, though, for the Palestinian citizens of Israel is rather their campaign of how do you deal and how do you live in a state that has shifted so much to the right. The legal battle, in other words. Israel of the 1990s, while it has always been Zionist, has not been tried to be much more of a state of its citizens, Over the past 20 years, it has shifted much more to the right. And that's where the problem is. The nationality law, for example, of Israel is much more of a concern, because the nationality law that Israel produced, issued in 2018, gives the right to self-determination only to the Jews, allows Jews to have settlements anywhere in the land of Israel. So that has repercussions on the legal status of Palestinians, all Palestinians, including the Palestinian citizens of Israel. So the way I see the Palestinian citizens of Israel playing a very important role because one, they live in Israel, two, they understand the Israeli politics, and they are the interlocutor between the Palestinians and the Israeli. And we see all of their activism mainly through the legal channels, but it has been a very frustrating legal channel, as we know also from the United States. So I don't know if this answers your question.
Yeah, good, thank you. Tony?
Yeah, the next question would be, considering its role in Israel's security, what are your predictions about a US-led war with Iran, particularly if Trump gets reelected again?
Yeah, I'm very worried about the possibility of even another October surprise. We have 2 weeks left of October. And I think, I don't think that either the US or Iran want full-scale war. I think there is also a majority view among military and security types in the US that a war with Iran would be disastrous. But I think that the possibility of what would look like and be called an accidental war, an accidental escalation, which would be not accidental at all, is a very real possibility. You know, if you look at the military solution, the military situation surrounding Iran, the US, I'm sorry for the helicopters, they're surrounding my house at the moment, it appears. Iran is surrounded by US military bases in all the countries around it. In the Persian Gulf, it's a highly militarized area where both Iranian and US ships are very active. There's a great deal of tension. And unlike situations, for example, in Syria, where the US made sure that it had a hot button relationship with Russia, for instance, to make sure that if there was any sort of unexpected escalation, they could immediately call and say, oops, this was a mistake, this was not whatever, ignore it and cool things down. They have no such relations with Iran. There is no direct relations. There's no military to military tie. There's no way to call back if a young sailor gets frightened on duty on deck at 3 o'clock in the morning and sees something that they think is somebody shooting at them and decides to shoot back, and some young Iranian sailor thinks that they're under attack because they are. It could be disastrous with no easy way out. That could well happen, and it could get very, very dangerous. So far, in these last years of escalation since the US under Trump pulled out of the Iran nuclear deal, Iran has not taken the bait. When it has responded to US provocations, it's responded quite moderately, let's say, without killing people. And how long that's going to last if the US continues to escalate its provocations is anyone's guess. The government in Iran is under enormous pressure politically. They face elections in June, and they're under pressure from a much harsher wing of the Iranian state and the supporters of that wing. So it's a very dangerous business, and we should not at all think that we're out of the woods in terms of the possibility of a major escalation between the US and Iran, just because nobody in the US press right now is talking about it.
Leila, did you want to add something to that?
Yeah, I see Phyllis's argument, but I tend to think that precisely because Iran is not being provoked. I mean, it's being provoked, but it's not taking the bait, as Phyllis. Definitely the Gulf is very much concerned about Iran, but I think the way I understand the American administration, and Trump tried to a little bit change it, but I don't see he is being effective with the army. The US is much more concerned about China and Russia than it is concerned about Iran. And Iran is a distraction in that respect, especially that anything to be solved in Iraq needs Iran. So, I mean, yeah, definitely. Trump, if he gets reelected, yeah, he will definitely, or as you said, maybe in the next 2 weeks, he will do something which would be very alarming. But the international community is very much against anything Trump does. And I think that will make some breaks, because the European Union made it clear they're not on board. They are keeping the channels open with the Iranian. They continued with the negotiation with the nuclear deal. The Chinese have made it clear that they are not for it. So I think if Trump were to do something, is to divert from domestic issues. I think also the US Army doesn't seem to be much on board. Of course, Pompeo is not the same thing, but I think the US Army doesn't want another. I mean, they're trying to get out of Afghanistan, which is going to be bad, is a way of strengthening further Iran, whether they like it or not, they are aware of that. So yeah, it's going to be alarming, but that's because the Trump administration is a very myopic, right-wing and self-serving in a very myopic way, rather than a strategic way of thinking.
Abby?
I'm just hoping November comes here quickly so that an October surprise doesn't happen. I know we're all hoping for that. Tony, I don't quite understand this next question. This person is saying that a single state with equal rights is not likely at this point in Israel. How about a United States? I think they may be referring to the solution for Israel-Palestine, a United States of Israel and Palestine with Jerusalem as a city-state. And perhaps they're asking, is that likely, or is that even?
I relate to this question. Now, in that respect, I'm happy to answer it. But I also want to remind everybody, when we talk about the one-state solution, we know that the two-state solution is dead, okay? But the one-state solution is not around the corner. I just want to make it clear.
What?
It's not around the corner. It's not clear, okay? People are struggling to define what is a one-state solution, especially practicality, because if you're talking about a one-state solution, you're talking about Israelis and Palestinians have equal rights, but this cannot happen before you talk about justice, historical rights, historical reconciliation, what is Jewish rights, what is migration rights, how do you do the right of return with the law of return, you know, who has a right to be in this country. So there are very, very big questions that have to do. On the defensive side, everybody says, I have rights, I should be protected, but then how do you live with the others? So actually, believe it or not, the idea of a United States, Israel-Palestine, is something that I've been thinking about lately, because I've realized that the United States, especially what we see with, you know, with this election, with Trump, with Black Lives Matters, with so much things that have not been resolved in the history of this country, the United States gives you an example of how you can be very different in your political views. You can be very different in what you think about the humanity of others or not. But there's still some certain basic rights that need to be protected. Right? I mean, Mitch McConnell, can we deal with Mitch McConnell? How can you deal with Mitch McConnell? The new Supreme Court judge that we're gonna have, you know, how do you combine, how can it's possible that you can have an Obama administration, after that, a Trump administration? The contradiction, no other country can combine these contradictions in visions, in ethics, but the United States still functions because there's still certain sets of institutions and laws that guarantees equality, even if it isn't always implemented, right? So actually, United States of Palestine, Israel could be very interesting, but
yeah. Louise is saying that there's
one point to that.
Yeah, please go ahead.
I mean, the issue of confederation has always been one of the models that people looked at around one state. It was one state, a la the South African model, where it's you know, one person, one vote. Others are national confederations. But I would just urge all of us. It's wonderful hearing Leila talk about that history and how Palestinians are seeing it vis-a-vis the United States and what we can learn from that. But for those of us who are not Palestinians and not Israelis, it is not our call. Our call is still about rights and equality. You know, that because it's about what our government is doing. And part of what our government does is make it all dependent on a two-state solution, which we know is over. But still, it's our focus, I think, really needs to be on the issue of equality and rights, and not the political structures of, is it one state or two states? If it's one state, is it a binational state, or is it a, you know, whatever? That's not for us. Our goal is to change our governments terrible role in perpetuating the denial of rights. And that, in a sense, also makes it easier for us. We don't have to sort through all this stuff. It's fascinating. We should learn about it. And eventually, Palestinians will have a majority position within the national movement about what the new stage looks like and all of that. But for the moment, we need to focus on changing what the US is doing. So
I cannot agree more what Phyllis was said. Yeah, the issue is Palestinian is rights, equal rights is as simple as that. Equal rights for the Palestinians. Yeah. Go ahead.
Can I just ask? Can I ask a question? Just a little more of a FYI for myself, Phyllis, if you would. Can you just remind me what the Democratic platform said about Israeli-Palestinian relations?
Yeah, I don't remember all the details. It was slightly worse than the last one 4 years ago. But the bottom line, I think, about those platforms is that they're far more important in how they get created than in what they ultimately say. What was important about the platform in 2016 and again in 2020, even more so, is that the issue of Palestinian rights was front and center in the discussion. It was public. It was put forward as this is what we need to be determining. The final decision wasn't very good, but you know what? Nobody pays attention to the platform after the election anyway, so that's really not important. What is important is it's no longer something you can't talk about. It's no longer assumed that military aid to Israel, uncritical support for Israeli settlements, that's the position of both parties and there's no more to be said. Suddenly there's a lot more to be said, and there's a lot more happening in Congress. You have the great Betty McCollum from Minnesota introducing now a stronger version of her great resolution that conditions military aid. There's a group of, I think it's up to about 25 members of Congress who have signed on to a Dear Colleague letter calling directly for conditionalities. These things aren't going very far, very fast, but it's huge that they have broken through what has been a complete denial of any of these issues coming into the debate. So I think that's actually far more important than what's in the final text. I frankly don't remember all the details of it.
That's fine. I think you answered my point. You made your point.
So Kareem is reminding us that the platform didn't include the word occupation, but it did say that even though BDS is not supported, it is allowed because of freedom of speech.
Right, right.
And to Leila's point beforehand, Louise says that Ami Ayalon, who was the former head of the Israeli Shin Bet, the Israeli CIA, said today that this is to Phyllis's point, that American Jews do have the right to weigh in on the issue, as what goes on in Israel affects Jews all over.
Yeah, well, he can say all that he wants, but we are Americans. It was actually, there was an incredible example of Trump's anti-Semitism not too long ago when he was speaking to a group of Republican funders, his people, Jewish funders led by Adelson. And he said to them, among other things, he was talking about the occupation of the Golan Heights being recognized by the US as legitimate. And he said, I was standing with your prime minister when I announced that. And nobody in the room raised their hand and said, excuse me, Mr. President, we're Americans. We're not Israelis. He's not our prime minister. And then he went on in that same meeting to deliberately call out his great funders, Sheldon and Miriam Adelson. And he said, when he was talking about moving the embassy to Jerusalem, he said, Sheldon and Miriam, I did it for you. Now, if that isn't an acknowledgement of the power of money in determining foreign policy, what the false claim was made about Ilhan Omar for saying that when she didn't say it, Trump did say it, and they seem to love it. Nobody accused him of anti-Semitism.
Yeah. Is there anyone else who has a question? We have time for a few more questions. We don't see anything yet in the chat. Dave,
you write it in the chat?
Can you write it in the chat, please?
Hello, Phyllis, what about Lebanon?
Oh, Lebanon, the tragedy of Lebanon. Lebanon has gone through hell and is still going through hell after this horrific explosion, an economic complete collapse, an expansion of COVID. All the while, it is taking care of so many Syrian refugees that right now the population of Lebanon is 1/4 Syrian refugees, 1/4 of the entire population. It would be as if 90 million refugees from Central America were being sheltered in the United States. It would be that level of what it means in terms of the population. It's extraordinary. I don't know, Leila, why don't you grab this on the politics of it? I'm just looking at the humanitarian part that's so disastrous.
Leila, unmute. Yeah.
Yeah, I think Lebanon is very sad and maybe in a way also emblematic of the situation of the whole Middle East, because this is a country which is small, which has some democratically functioning government. It's not an authoritarian, it doesn't have oil, but it has had a corrupt government and a debt that is unsurmountable and is now under. It needs foreign intervention. I mean, now being progressive in Lebanon is calling for the IMF to come and help the situation and how desperate it can, but just tells you how desperate the situation is. And in that respect, now there's some talk about the Lebanese and the Syrian and the Israelis talking about gas discovery in the Mediterranean to demarcate who can dig where. Is just, and again, emblematic of how dire the situation is in the Middle East, because the past 30 years for Middle Eastern countries have been lost years in the sense they did not develop economically, they did not develop politically, they've become more oppressive, but they're not create, people accept oppression if they are eating, but people do not accept oppression if they're not eating. And to think that the regimes there are sustainable after what happened in Syria or in Iraq or even in Egypt, it's not. You need a whole new model of governing. And we can see how is that going to happen, because right now is the rise of what we call conservative Arab regimes, Saudi Arabia, the Arab Emirates, the regimes that want to strengthen authoritarian regime, law and order at the expense of rights. Lebanon is just, people are waiting for it to implode. I mean, I don't know how more it will implode than what it did. But the only rescue for Lebanon is, IMF intervening and
I would say that
the country together. But this is gonna be very bad for the people because it's gonna create more poverty. It's not less poverty.
You want to take Louise's question, Abby?
Just before we get to that, I wanted to add just one point on Lebanon, that I think it's not a coincidence of time. It's not only the desperation of the government and the people that they're willing for the first time to negotiate with Israel on anything other than a border issue. Yeah. These negotiations over the gas drilling in the Mediterranean about where the borders at sea come in is a reflection of what is the consequence of the Gulf states normalizing their relations with Israel. It makes it possible for Lebanon to do that. Sorry, you wanted to go on to Louisa.
Yeah, in that respect, sorry, another point I need to explain, and I think it helps to see the annexation in that paradigm. What has happened with the annexation and the regional implication, the fact that the Gulf, now they think Saudi Arabia will sign a peace deal with Israel, but the Emirates and Bahrain, it's an indication that for the first time, it's official in the Middle East region, that people think, or at least the Gulf states think the Iran conflict, the Iran-Arab conflict is more important and more dangerous than the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Yeah. And with this, I mean, I don't know how far this will carry sway. It's carrying sway somehow, but in such a regional configuration of this way of seeing problem, the problem of rights versus oppression becomes even more acute. And the alliance between colonial regimes like Israel and authoritarian regimes like Saudi Arabia or like Egypt become much more clear. But also the solution to this problem is not clear because, as I said, people will accept oppression if they're eating. Okay? But if people are not eating and are in prison and are refugees, it's only a question of time when they will rebel again. And we saw this in 1948. People did not see the regimes collapsing in the Arab world after 1948. After 48, within 5 years, we had major changes in political regimes and political ideology in the Middle East. we saw something with the Arab uprising, it got crushed, but I don't believe that what got crushed in the Arab uprising will be repressed for very long. We're gonna see another wave coming up, especially with COVID and the crisis that COVID created for the economies of everybody. What we don't know is under what agenda they'll come out, how would they be organized? What we know that everybody is asking for equal rights, for the states to protect the rights of the people, not to oppress the people. How they will exert their influence, we still don't know. But Lebanon actually gives us some very good example about mass mobilization. Mm-hmm. People talking about rights, local rights, starting with cities, reclaiming cities before reclaiming the state, let's solve the garbage before trying to solve the problem with Israel, which are all about local engagement and local responsibility and accountability that starts to trying to work from the bottom up rather than top down.
Yeah. Johnny, I saw Louise's question, but I also have a question, if I might ask.
Yeah, go right ahead.
So we've all seen these huge protests on Balfour Street in Jerusalem outside of Netanyahu's house, and a lot of Israelis coming out across the country protesting, wanting Bibi to resign. They're also protesting the handling of the COVID crisis. And there are some voices on the far left in Israel who are saying, well, you're so concerned about Israelis, but Palestinians have been living with oppression for so long. Why aren't you protesting the same thing? And I'm just wondering if you think that there'd be any osmosis or any sort of transfer of that energy, that now that they've gotten out into the streets, maybe they will also protest on behalf of Palestinian rights.
We're not seeing it. We're not seeing it yet.
One of the tragedies of Oslo, one of the tragedies of the peace process, we're talking about 23 years now, not 27 years, maybe 30 years of peace process, is that Israelis know less the Palestinian today than they did 20 years ago. During the years of direct occupation, Israelis saw Palestinians all the time. Israelis hired Palestinians all the time. 1/3 of the Palestinian workers were working in Israel. Since the peace process, the Palestinians just vanished for the Israeli public. And the Israelis have been doing so well without Palestinians. I mean, they would have never imagined that their economy, their prestige, their position in the EU, their alliance with Israel will boost while they are oppressing Palestinians. So I don't see, I think there's a very important role for the Israelis to play, but as progressive Israelis say it, the Israelis are not going to do anything if they don't feel the burn, if it doesn't hurt, and it doesn't hurt. They're doing very well. They're not paying any price, not any. So why would they bother?
There's two examples of this, I think. One is in the Occupy movement in 2011, which would have been a moment when the Arab Spring was rising. All around the world, Occupy movements were rising. There was a huge Occupy movement in Tel Aviv. It had 25,000 people every day out in the streets. And their formal agreement was, we will not talk about Palestine. Because if we do, we won't have so many people. That's number one. Number two is the polls. The polls show that there's an inverted relationship between the age of the people being polled and how far to the right they are. The furthest right wing in Israel is the youngest. And the oldest are the most progressive, relatively. That's a very dangerous thing. I did want to say something about Louise's question here about Peter Baynard's piece, which I think was very important. The piece in the New York Times, I don't know if you all saw it, but Peter Baynard, of course, is a very influential part historically of the sort of liberal Zionist movement in the US. Writes in The Atlantic. He was an editor of The Atlantic. He's an editor of Jewish Currents. He's very smart. He's very brilliant. It was a terrific piece in the context of what it was being in the New York Times, but from who wrote it, it was extraordinary. I had some discussions with him about it and what it reflects. It reflects a real abandonment of one of the leading lights, one of the most credible voices of liberal Zionism. It was a real abandonment of most of the tenets of liberal Zionism, not all, but most of the tenets of liberal Zionism. He was saying, it's done, it's hopeless, it doesn't work, there's no hope there. And I think it's enormously important for that reason, partly because of what he talked about. He talked about the need for a single state, et cetera, which frankly, I think has less credibility coming from anybody in the US, any Jews in the US in particular. But he acknowledged that what he had fought for all these years, very, very brilliantly, was a two-state solution. And he says, it's gone, it's over, it's dead. That was what was so important about this. It was a recognition that what he had fought for was not going to happen. And you don't have that very often from somebody in a position as influential as Peter Beinart. So I thought it was enormously important.
Can I ask a question?
Sure.
Okay. I just was wondering if there is something to this idea that relations, normalization with Arab nations, they can take home the fact that say, well, we had that and we were able to do that, therefore there's no annexation. Is that going to be something that's played out on and on? Are we going to keep this annexation in the background to be pulled out whenever they fear for some sort of, they want some sort of normalization with an Arab state?
No, the annexation played its role. The threat of annexation already was cashed in. Okay, it was used to cash in, to break the taboo of Israel, to break the taboo that you first solve the Palestinian rights and then you have normalization with Israel. It ended, as Phyllis explained, it ended the Arab peace proposal. So whether more states will make peace with Israel is not going to be here and there anymore, in my view, because it became clear to everybody. They are not the first states to normalize with Israel, want to normalize with Israel. We know for years that Morocco had a strong relationship with Israel. We know for years that Jordan had it before it signed the peace. We know also that there's a peace deal between Israel and Egypt and Israel and Jordan, and it hasn't impacted the people. It has been a deal between companies or a deal between governments. So what is being accentuated, I think that what's happening today is a shift about how you talk about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. It's making it again, now finally, it's shifting from being two people get two states and we solve it, to becoming, you know what, there are some oppressed people in the Middle East and there are some oppressors. And the oppressors are not just the Israelis, not just the Zionists. The oppressors are also the Saudis, are also the Sisi of Egypt, are also various regimes who are based their existence on oppressing their people. And I think when the things shift in this way, then the counter narrative needs to be about rights, about equality for all, and that the Palestinians cannot get the right if the Lebanese don't get the rights, if the Syrians don't get the right, and if the Saudis do not get the rights. How do you organize a new regional movement without the fanfare of Arab nationalism, but with the concrete basis of calling for equal rights and accountability? Is a challenge. What goes in its favor is that it's a generation that believes in institutions, it's a generation that is not looking for a savior anymore. It's a generation that understands very well state oppression. What it lacks is the economic resources to be organized and not crushed, because this is what's happening. In a situation like Iraq, how can you talk about Palestine before you have electricity? Palestine is much better than Syria. Palestinians in Gaza, however awful it is, I don't think their situation is worse than those who are in Syria. The two are tied together. So that shift in debate, it doesn't mean that you're going to marginalize the Palestinian question. It means that the Palestinian question becomes tied with the progressive agenda regionally. Because also the way the Jews are being reintroduced into the region, like in the Emirates and Saudi Arabia is trying to introduce, like, you know what, the Jews are our cousins, they always lived in the Middle East, our enemies now are the Shia, this is a state discourse of manipulation. It has the advantage, good, okay, if Jews are our cousins and Jews have been Arabs, are always Arab, good, let's open the whole file then. Let's talk about equal rights for everybody. Okay, so it's opening a window, but the window can also be furthered into a liberation movement or crushed into a more oppressive agenda.
Thank you.
there's a similar point also on the question about Yemen.
Yeah, go ahead, Phyllis.
Because in what we're seeing in the regional competition between Saudi Arabia and Iran in particular, that's being fought out in Yemen. The UAE was playing a major role there, then they pulled back. It's really now very much Saudi Arabia as the major responsible party for the massive humanitarian disaster in Yemen. The Iranian support for the Houthi rebels has never been very much, and the Houthis have made clear they are not accountable to the Iranians at all. The Iranians urged them not to attack, and they said, "Thank you for your advice," and they went ahead and attacked. They don't view themselves as being Iranian puppets. This is something created by the US, basically, to say that this is a proxy war. It's a proxy war on the one side, but not on the other side. Unlike some of the other proxy wars, this is a war where one side, the Houthi side, are a legitimate resistance movement within Yemen. Whatever the value of it is, the legitimacy of it, but they have a long history that goes way back before Iran had anything to do with it. So what we're dealing with now is the continuation of what the UN has called the worst humanitarian disaster in the world. It's going from bad to worse because now with COVID, they not only are facing the spread of COVID, but more and more international aid organizations are pulling out because their people can't operate there because of COVID. It's a cyclical thing. So the situation in Yemen is absolutely disastrous and getting worse. And the only solution to it is going to be some kind of a forced end to the Saudi bombing, which the US is playing a major role in. There's a new Dear Colleague letter that was just published tonight that got, I think, 45, if I'm not mistaken, I think as many as 45 members of Congress who signed on calling for the US to refuse to participate in the G20 meeting in Saudi Arabia unless a number of conditions were met that had to do both with Saudi Arabia's role, internal human rights issues, and ending the war in Yemen. So it was a very powerful one. So there's a lot of shifts going on, but in the meantime, it's similar to the war in Syria in the sense that there are outside parties being willing to fight to the last Yemeni. In this case, it's not even Yemeni fighters, it's Yemeni civilians who are doing the dying.
Leila, did you want to add anything to that? Wait a second.
I think Phyllis put it very nicely, and I think this ties with the question that was posed, I saw in the chat, about climate change, how climate change will impact the region. And I think the climate change will impact the region massively because, first of all, there are studies done by MIT that the Gulf states will be unlivable in 30 years' time. The level of heat that because of global warming, that life in the Gulf would be, which means that you will need to have money, a lot of ACs, which I don't know how much, which enhances the environment problem. But I think what the environmental crisis will accentuate the problem of inequality, which was at the heart of the Arab uprising. The cause of the Arab uprising was inequality, and was caused by environmental reasons in Syria, for at least is the drought of the previous years that led to massive migration towards cities and towards, more oppression by the state because it wanted to prevent them, which got people rebelled against. So I think climate change will accentuate the inequality. Climate change will accentuate the need for government to find solution, which means employment, environmental projects, a different way of dealing with the government, with people, which means they're not going to continue to get, whether it's going to be financed through more aid or through economic development. And I also think the impact of the environment will be, Europe will be very much concerned because the environmental crisis is going to push more and more migration to Europe. And we've seen Europe is not take more and more migrants, which means that Europe will be involved again in trying to find a way of how to make or enable Middle Eastern state to be more sustainable. And oppression is not the best way to make a state sustainable. It solves a minor problem in the short term, but not in the long term.
Yeah.
It's going to be, just one quick point on that, it's going to be particularly difficult in the smaller Gulf states where such high percentages, like in the UAE, 88% of the population are not UAE citizens. They're not Emiratis. They're from the poorest countries. They're from, some are sort of middle-class Palestinians and Egyptians who are the doctors and the teachers and the lawyers, but the majority of the workers, construction workers, all the people who deal with that reality of what the climate is, are from Bangladesh, the Philippines, Pakistan, India, countries that export large numbers of workers because there's no work for them at home. And these people have no rights. They have no rights. Their passports are taken when they arrive and given to their employer to hold on to as a way of control. It's essentially almost a kind of slavery. And that's not going to be sustainable for very long.
Yeah. So once again, thank you, Phyllis and Leila, for answering all those questions. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you so
all.
much.
Jeff Klein, we want to know what we can do here in the United States, what actions we can take. And Phyllis mentioned earlier the Betty McCollum legislation bill suggestion, the Dear Colleague letter. Jeff, are you there? Jeff is the coordinator, has been the longtime coordinator of the Mass Peace Action Palestine-Israel Working Group. So Jeff, over to you.
Yeah, hi, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Good. So, you know, it was really a pleasure to hear Leila and Phyllis outline, you know, the general situation with annexation, and for us to be reminded that annexation is not an event that may or may not happen. It's a process that's been going on for a century. It's the core of the Zionist project, annexation and denial of self-determination to the indigenous people in Palestine. And we have to recognize that certainly since the creation of the State of Israel, and especially since 1967, the chief enabler and supporter of this process in Palestine has been our own government in the United States. And as Phyllis said, the best way as Americans, the best way for us to address the issue of justice in Palestine and Israel is to work to change the policy of our own government, what I like to call the 50-state solution. You know, that really it's the US that is the principal obstacle to movement in the direction of justice and peace in Palestine and Israel. So, you know, it's a daunting uphill struggle to change US policy for all the reasons that we've heard. But there are some positive signs now too. For the first time that I can remember, there's now a nucleus in the House of Representatives, especially of members who consistently support Palestinian rights. Betty McCollum is one, the squad, including our own Ayanna Pressley, is another important part of that. And the number of those people is going to increase in the new Congress by several. Notably, Jamal Bowman in New York, who defeated, you know, the principal enabler in Congress, Eliot Engel, the chair of the Foreign Relations Committee. And so there's some positive change, but it's still going to be a long struggle. But, you know, along with all the other things, all the other aspects in which we fight for justice, like BDS, public education, active action on campuses, we can't ignore the issue of politics and public policy, even though we have a long road ahead of us. The S in BDS, sanctions, is something only that governments can do. Private people can boycott, institutions can divest, but only governments can sanction a government like Israel, as happened and was the final blow against apartheid South Africa. So a number of organizations that have co-sponsored this event tonight are involved in political advocacy on behalf of Palestinian rights, including the hosts and Mass Peace Action, Jewish Voice for Peace, and others. And we've recently come together to form a statewide coalition, which I'm hoping I can show you. No, it doesn't seem to work. Anyway, we call it Massachusetts Against Israeli Annexation, organizing to uphold international law and end Israeli impunity. And what we focus on is making it easy for citizens that belong to the various constituent organizations to pressure their members of Congress on these issues. And there are a couple of issues before Congress right now that we hope will be renewed in the new Congress. Betty McCollum's bill to defend the rights of Palestinian children, or at least to forbid U.S. funding of the abuse of Palestinian children, was reintroduced this year in this Congress as well as the last. There's also a new and very significant bill, H.R. 8050, the Israel Annexation Non-Recognition Act, that was entered, a few months ago, and has, slowly been accumulating co-sponsors. We've had actions in a number of alerts to enable supporters of Palestinian rights to pressure their members of Congress to co-sponsor these various bills, and we'll continue that as they're refiled in the new Congress. And I'd ask you, if you are part of this webinar, and whether or not you belong to any of the constituent organizations that belong to this coalition, to contact Watertown citizens to be referred to whatever organization is most amenable to your activism, and that will most likely be one of the organizations that's part of our Massachusetts Against Israeli Annexation coalition. One other issue that's coming up very soon that we're trying to figure out how to intervene in a positive way is that with the defeat of Eliot Engel, the chair of the House Foreign Relations Committee, there will have to be the selection of a new chair. And that committee is very, very key to all the issues around Israel in Congress, Israel funding, various legislation supporting Israel. And there's a battle for who will be the new chair of that committee. And there are three principal candidates. One, Brad Sherman, is essentially a continuation of Eliot Engel's support for Israel and opposition to the Iran deal. Gregory Meeks from New York is another candidate. And probably the best is Joaquin Castro, who was for a time presidential candidate. And we're trying to, along with MAPA and other organizations, figure out a way to intervene in that contest. It's a very key position for the whole policy of war and peace and Israel relations with the United States. And a new head of that committee cannot fail to be an improvement. The question is whether it'll be a slight improvement or a big improvement. And we believe that Joaquin Castro probably is the best option for some real change in US policy. So if you sign up to be part of this network of political advocacy, we'll be providing some tools for taking action around these issues, as we have around supporting the bills in Congress. So I just would ask you to, Tony, do people know? Yeah, so there's an email address. If you email in the chat, if you email Watertown citizens, they can refer you to the organization that, where you can, get information and help in your activism. And, this is a battle that we have to wage. And a reminder, it took more than 10 years between the first filing of sanctions against South Africa in Congress until it was finally passed in the mid-'80s. And that was the final blow. It wasn't the first, it was the final blow that led to a negotiated change of government in South Africa and the initiation of voting rights for everybody. So we have to take a long view of this, and I hope most of you will be in it for that long run.
Thank you so much, Jeff. Excellent.